Okay. Okay, so this is a concept about the carbon continuum in the solar system that Faith Vilas and I have been working on, and it summarizes a paper that we put out a couple of years ago, but we've been kind of working on evolving it since then. So I just wanted to share it and maybe get some feedback from the people on this workshop.
Yeah.
So generally, when we think about carbon in the solar system, at least I typically think about CO and CO2 and methane and so forth, and then hydrocarbons and the wide class of organics and PAWs and then, you know, carbon, soot, amorphous carbon, lamp black, however you might want to call it, and graphite and solins. And then on Earth, we have analogous types of things like coal and kerogen. And this project all kind of started because Faith and I were trying to put together kind of a library of ultraviolet spectra to help interpret some spacecraft measurements, but also to understand, you know, what the spectra of all of these different species look like in the UV especially. And in working on understanding these and reading a lot in the literature, it occurred to us that all of these things are really linked through a lot of the stuff that Yvonne has talked about and that we'll hear about in the rest of the workshop. I wonder if I can get rid of this Adobe Connect window here.
Minimize that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Is that minimized?
No.
Okay. Sorry, folks.
You have to close it. Don't close it.
Okay. Okay, so part of this is related to work that was done on some Earth-based carbons, coals, and we looked at how they evolved spectrally with processing. So this is a plot showing data of different terrestrial coals of increasing aromaticity as you go up. And so it's a subbituminous coal at the bottom, and then it goes up to a graphite, a very evolved graphite up at the top, and you can see how the spectra change, especially in the UV. In the Viz, not much happens. They're pretty spectrally flat, but in the UV, you start to develop a very strong absorption there around 200 nanometers, and it changes in strength depending on how processed the material is. So this is one way of looking at this. Another way of looking at this, and this UV feature, as we know, has been studied a lot by people who study the ISM, because this is this 217 nanometer feature that's seen in the ISM and that has been studied a lot. And so people have shown that as you look at carbon materials that are less graphitized, so they have more hydrogen in them, and then they become more carbonized or graphitized and lose their hydrogen, this 217 angstrom feature evolves and becomes stronger. Okay, and a lot of researchers have looked at this. Okay, so this is just one example. Another example is shown here from another paper, just showing that as hydrogen is lost, which can happen with UV irradiation or thermal processing or radiolytic processing, you get a stronger and more distinct UV absorption feature. And this feature corresponds to this electronic transition from a valence band to a conduction band. Okay, so there's a lot of literature on this that's studied again in the ISM and not so much with regard to our solar system. And in general, there's a lot of words on this slide, but I kind of want to read through them. This is more about evolution of the spectrum with processing. On the right is a plot that's pretty busy, but this is from a CARE paper from 1987, I think. And it shows the imaginary part of the optical constant for various species. And as you go from the, and it covers about from the vis out through the IR. And so as you go from the bottom of the plot, you've got tholins, a type of tholin, different types of tholins actually. And then as you go up, you get more processed species. You get I think it's CH2 maybe, diamond-like carbon, graphite, soot, etc. And the shape of the K term spectrally changes. The spectrum of it changes. It becomes flatter. It becomes much higher in K and much more absorbing. Okay, so in the ISM, and this is some of what I think the same stuff of what Yvonne was saying. We've got dust grains thought to be pause and fullerenes existing as free molecules, and also more complex aromatic molecules that are formed by UV photoprocessing. The UV irradiation can result in gradual aromatization or even total carbonization of the sample. And so that's how we can end up with carbonaceous matter such as amorphous carbon. Okay, in the ISM, it has been found that heated grains tend to form more aromatic structures and tend to crystallize, while the more cooler grains and denser regions can stay amorphous and prefer aliphatic bonding. I think a question about that distribution kind of came up during Yvonne's talk. So, and also with thermal processing, carbonaceous materials generally undergo increasing aromatization and loss of aliphatic side chains, and so you end up with a darker and more featureless spectrum. So different researchers coming at this from different angles, but kind of getting to the same conclusion in a lot of ways. And what CARE noted is that with high enough temperatures, hydrocarbons will partially dissociate and generate a higher carbon content by hydrogen extraction, so just loss of hydrogen. And then more related to our solar system is work by Andronico and Stratsula, talking about organic containing surfaces being exposed to radiation and eventually becoming darker and blacker, really related to this plot on the right here. And this is linked to, their work was linked to Phoebe being so dark and gray that probably its outermost layers are carbonized by cosmic protons, whereas we know the internal Phoebe material is probably fresher and more rich in pause, as Dale has talked about and we'll talk about. And so this brought us to come up with a concept called the carbon continuum, where in our solar system we think that we may be able to see a reflection of all of this processing in the carbon species that we see on the surfaces of a lot of the bodies. In closer to the sun, where we have more UV irradiation and heating and more solar wind, we ought to see more complex hydrocarbons, more aromatic, and more carbonized species. Whereas farther out, where there's less UV irradiation and less heating and less solar wind, we ought to see more hydrogen, more aliphatic, and less carbonization happening. And this can translate to the actual species we see. Where in close, we might expect to see more graphite, maybe more amorphous carbon, and out in the outer solar system, more tholins and more pause. Now, this is a very simplified version, of course, of this whole picture, because materials on the surfaces get processed, of course, and so what we see on the surfaces can be expected to be different from what might be in the interior of bodies, which would be more pristine. And also, stuff gets moved around, right? Like Bill was saying, stuff that might have been more originally formed in the outer solar system probably got moved in and maybe living in more of the inner to mid solar system currently. But this is perhaps a picture of how we can think about how things might have started. So do the data actually support it? Well, here I think are the data points in the solar system that we have so far. And we'll hear about a lot of these things at this workshop. So this may change. But at Mercury, I think we have evidence of graphite. Phobos Deimos moving out. I don't know if we know exactly what's happening there in terms of carbon. At Ceres, we think that there's graphitized carbon on the surface, but aliphatic signatures are also seen, perhaps coming from the interior. And Themis, another asteroid we know, shows signatures of aromatics and aliphatics. Farther out, closer to 5 AU, I don't know if we know what's going on yet with the outer Jovians. Callisto and Ganymede, I think, show evidence for some carbonization happening on their surfaces. And Trojans, I don't know if we know just yet. I think we need better spectra, but we'll certainly learn a lot with Lucy. Titan, I don't think we'll hear too much about at this workshop, but of course that's its kind of own beast. A lot of Solon there, oddly seeming to be stemming from the atmosphere, and I don't think we understand the source of the methane in the atmosphere. And then out at Pluto, as Dale will tell us, Solons and Phoebe, Iapetus, and the Hyperion aromatics and aliphatics. And then each comet is a little different, but I know that I guess we have signatures of aromatics on 67P. So I think we might be starting to put together kind of a picture of the carbon continuum in our solar system, but we need a lot more data, and we need more observations with better resolution, spatial resolution, and also better spectral coverage. You know, I talked about the variation in UV signature. We also have UV signatures of pause that we should be able to see. And then, of course, in the IR, the signatures of aromatics and aliphatics that we'll hear about. So I think better resolution and spectral coverage will help us understand the body, carbon on the bodies in the solar system and how it evolves. And so that's it for me.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice talk, Amanda.
Thank you. I'm interested in feedback and questions if anybody has any.
Yes, well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I was just going to mention that, you know, that was a huge oversight on my part not to even mention the 2217 Angstrom feature. But primarily it's because I'm an infrared astronomer, and I'm focusing on the infrared, but that the UV component is really what started it all. It was that bump that made everybody wonder about it. And the diffused interstellar bands that people have been trying to identify for years are, of course, related to that. And some people think that PAHs are the explanation for both the bump and other diffused bands. But that's kind of a war that I try to stay out of. But anyhow, I should have at least included that component in my talk. So thanks for doing that.
So I've got a question, Amanda.
Okay.
And that is that, you know, the picture that you showed of the continuum really depends on a sort of a differential of a whole list of, let's call them processing mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all to, like, what studies have been done quantitatively to sort of look at the budgets of where the energy might come from and what the mechanisms might be in a quantitative sense. You know, is there enough energy, or is there enough energy differential in these different places to kind of fill in that picture?
I don't have any specifics to share with you. That's kind of the next step that we've been taking is budgets in terms of energy and also timing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
I'm really interested in how long it should take for these
absolutely
spectra to change.
Yeah.
And what that can tell us about how long this body has been in this place.
Absolutely.
When did it get moved there?
Yeah, so both power and integrated energy.
So I think that there's literature out there, and maybe other people know and can speak up, but that's kind of the next thing that I'm going to be digging into. So definitely an important point.
Okay, Amanda, I think we've got a long question that's been typed in. I cannot see it here.
Okay, was that Diane?
Might have to scroll up.
Yeah, I don't know. Ashcon, you need to scroll for me. I can't read.
Diane,
Maybe you can see it, Amanda. I don't mean to hold you up.
okay, Diane's comment is, comet dust has a spectrally highly absorbing component. Searching for tholins and ratio of unprocessed is challenging. Yep. Highly absorbing forms of carbon, aromatic bonds, may dominate spectrally, but may not be dominant in samples. One wonders how we approach this question. Yes, I agree, and I also think that even though we've sampled a few comets, it's not a consistent story, right? And that tells us that maybe they're from different source regions and maybe have undergone different levels of processing, perhaps due to, how many traverses they have made through the inner solar system. I don't know if I'm getting at your question or point.
The question about the sensitivity of the spectral lines to the chemical content? That's what it seems to be.
Okay. Tholins, I mean, I kind of have a little issue with tholins because, of course, they're kind of particular. There's all sorts of different kinds of tholins, and I think the main thing that we know about them, but Dale and Yvonne chime in, is a reddish vis near IR slope. I guess there's IR features too, at 3.1-ish or so. But I'm sure that they must vary depending on what kind of stuff you're irradiating.
So it's like, it's hard to know. We have a good idea of the parameters of spectral space there.
Right. Right.
This is Dale. I certainly echo what you said about the variety of tholins and the variety of colors and spectral features that they present. It's not a discipline that is well organized because tholins are made from such a variety of materials for a variety of planetary environments, at least presumed environments. But trying to systematize the starting materials, the degree of processing, and the outcome is a worthy goal for some fairly large-scale laboratory experimental program. It's certainly true that there are some spectral features in some tholins, even as short as 2 microns, as seen in some of the stuff that Vishen Kari did many years ago. The problem is that it's difficult to connect a spectral feature to a molecular pathway or a molecular origin in this very complex material. So we've been kind of relegated to just sort of matching colors. Now, I hope that this does improve, but I would point out that for most solar system objects, the spectral information available does not go out far enough in the infrared to reach the place where we see good molecular signatures. The hope is that the JWST instruments will change that dramatically. And you mentioned the issue of the Trojan asteroids, which have been an especially difficult nut to crack because we see basically 2 color classes, and we can't really figure out what colors either one of those. So, but there again, we're limited in spectral coverage just because these things are faint. So it's hoped that the JWST will shed some really important light on that particular issue, but also on a wide variety of other solar system objects. And I echo what you said about the satellites of Mars as well. We still don't really quite understand those. So there are big gaps in this continuum that that you and Faith have presented, which is very interesting, but big gaps which are in desperate need of clarification.
Yep. Need more data.
There's a long question on there by Mark that got scrolled up, so if you can.
Okay. Mark Freeze?
Yeah. But if you scroll up,
Okay.
maybe it's up there somewhere.
NASA JFC? There should be some caution. Okay. So there should be some caution in using graphitization for carbon process in parent bodies in particular. This is not an unbroken thermodynamic continuum from pause to graphite. there is a significant thermodynamic barrier for transition from polycrystalline graphite to single crystal graphite to the point that crystalline graphite is very rare. Okay, good, as a metamorphic product. Good point. Something to keep in mind when thinking, well, and I think this is getting at your point. I think that there's a lot of different graphites out there, right? And so, and even amorphous carbons, one spectrum that somebody measures of amorphous carbon or graphite in the lab is not the same as somebody else's. And for amorphous carbon, I think that's related to the amount of hydrogen that's actually present in the sample, but for graphites, it might have to do with how crystalline it actually is. If I'm understanding your point right, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. And
Okay.
I've just scrolled
Is there
through to
anything else? Okay.
make sure we got all the questions. I think we've got everything that's been typed in. And again, just to remind people that if you have called in, you can ask your question by phone as well. You don't have to do this just typing in.
Okay. So the next presentation